Hello YouTube and Swapper fellows. Today I am going to show you engine modifications, but first let me just take off my zebra blanket and open bonnet. So this is I guess the only action of this video. There isn't going to be any more action in comparison to previous video. And yes, in previous video I've also announced that I will make one video about engine and engine bay modifications, but I've already made some test shots and it's going super long, so there is no way I am going to put this into one video, so I will have to break it into, I don't know, 2-3 videos. But what's most important, today I will cover everything about swapping my OM606 engine. And when I mean engine modifications in this video, I mean everything bolted to the engine. But first let's go through the story, because people usually do things for a reason. So I bought this car in 2009, and this small cheat sheet will just give you a better idea of why I've chosen OM606. So this particular vehicle, this particular model is W463 328, which means this is the long wheelbase version, and this car was produced in 1999, and these models were released between 90 and 94, and they had OM603 a 931 engine, and this was 3-liter, 6 cylinders with natural aspiration. And what's important with this engine, factory engine that was in this car, is that it has off-road specification, which means it has a deeper oil pan, different oil pump, different dipstick tube guide. Then it has 5-speed manual gearbox. It also has 1.05 reduction in transfer case and pretty big gears in differentials, 5.28, and you can figure out that with these gears it is very easy to install 35-inch tires, and this was my idea from the beginning. But unfortunately the engine was very poor, so my first idea of this car when I bought it 2009 was obviously to go into this engine. And this engine is OM603 972, and this is 3.5-liter engine. And this engine also comes from W463, so the same G-class as this one, but with bigger engine. And these G-classes were released between 92 and 93. Okay, so this is a mistake. This is 6, should be here. So it's a typo. So this engine was turbocharged. It had a 4-speed automatic gearbox, but in transfer case, the road gear was 0.87, and in differentials it had 4.11 gears. So in this configuration there is no idea to install 35-inch tires. So this configuration is much better. So my idea was to buy this version and swap it to 3.5-liter OM603, but I never did that. Now it is much more convenient to swap into OM606, and there are actually 3 choices. The first one is OM606 961, and this one comes from W140 passenger car. The second option is 606 962 engine, and this is exactly the same 606, but this one comes from W210 O passenger car. And the third and the best option is to go OM606 964 engine, and this one comes directly from W463 G-Class, and this is the best option because you get everything in one package. I mean oil pan, oil pump, dipstick, engine mounts, everything in G-Class specification. But these engines are the most expensive and they are rare. I saw them on German eBay, and yes, they are expensive. So in my case, I found offer of some company that is rebuilding worn trucks and sell them to Africa, and they offered this engine 962 from W210 passenger car. So because of their profile, I mean what they do, I didn't even ask about the mileage of this engine. I knew I would go with full rebuild, so I just put it on my truck and then I took it home. So this is a story how I got this engine. I knew that I own this OM603 931 engine that was factory here in this vehicle. So I knew I can swap all the parts from this engine to this, and I will keep off-road specification. So this is my story. This is why I chosen OM606. There are also other reasons, like this is my first swap ever. I wanted this swap to be as straightforward as possible. I wanted to have a reliable solution, also resistant for decent fuel quality. I wanted it also to be as much factory as possible, and I wanted to do it myself. So these are arguments behind my choice. So once I got engine home, I took it apart because I knew I will go for rebuild. Plus I needed to merge some parts from my factory engine. So I also took the factory engine apart, and then I gave components of this engine to soda blasting. I also took engine head and cylinder block to machining shop where they do all that machining stuff, like for example they check centricity of crankshaft. And after I got these parts, well, they were also soda blasted like all the parts from this engine. So I painted everything with a spray. So it was a lot of painting and masking everything with masking tape to paint obviously outside the engine. And once I had all the components ready to be assembled again, I started assembly. So during the assembly I replaced all the gaskets, seals, O-rings, all the steel bearings were replaced. I've also replaced hydraulic valve adjustments. So everything was rubber, what is a seal or O-ring was replaced. I've also replaced camshaft chain, camshaft slider. I don't know what's the name, but piston O-rings. They were also obviously replaced. Everything inside this engine is stock. So there is nothing crazy with this engine. So the engine was rebuilt for a reason, that when I go somewhere further, I am not going to have any kind of surprise. Okay, so this is the story behind the engine itself. I mean, no peripherals. So having factory OM603 and this particular model gives me just a lot of benefits and makes this swap very straightforward. So now let's talk about engine mounts. So they are also taken directly from my factory engine, both left and right. So they fit perfectly OM606 cylinder block, and they are important because of two reasons. So first, all the 603 and 606, they are tilted. I mean, the engine is not like this mounted in a car, but it's tilted like this. And there are two benefits from this mount. So down there is a water pump which was replaced, and it's driven by this belt. And then we have Visco that was also replaced, and fan that was also replaced. And this fan is rotating inside this plastic casing, and this casing is at the back of cooling unit. So this is my cooling stack, and this is actually factory cooling stack. This is how it was designed in factory. And once you use factory mounts from OM603 to OM606, you get center of this rotation in the center of this plastic cover. And this plastic cover, as I said, sits at the back of a cooling unit. So once this fan is rotating, this plastic cover does not allow air to go around it, because this plastic cover makes air go entirely through this cooling unit. So in my opinion, it is pretty important to keep this plastic cover, and this is factory solution. So this has somewhere on its casing factory number, and it consists of two parts. So you can undo this part. Yes, here you have open and close, so you turn it right to open, and then you can take out this cover. And I saw a couple of swaps without this cover, and I think the German engineers made it for a reason. So I wanted to also keep this cover. I think it's important. Those engines with pre-chamber has some kind of issues with overheating, so I wanted to keep that plastic cover. And there is yet another benefit from making this engine tilted, and we have to jump under the car. So under the car, this is like Blair Witch Project experience, but it's like under the car. So this is the passenger side engine mount, and this comes directly from my 603 G-Class engine, and as you can see, it fits perfectly. There are 4 bolts, 4th is hidden. Here, this is also factory mount, but it's replaced with a new bushing, and this is factory frame engine mount. And the same situation is at the driver side, but at the driver side, this is the visibility is very poor. I don't know if you will see anything, but the idea is the same. So this is the frame factory mount, so no modifications here, just a little bit visibility of rubber bushing, and up there there is driver side OM603 engine mount. Okay, so now let's see at the oil pan. So this is the oil pan from OM603 from my factory engine. There is a number 603-014-1102, and this oil pan comes directly from my 603 engine. In 603 engine, the crankshaft revolution sensor is located down here, so this goes directly to the RPM display at dashboard. It bolts to adapter plate from DP UK, and it fits perfectly to the cylinder block of OM606. And this oil pan is also deeper in comparison to a passenger car. So what's not visible is oil pump from my old engine that is also installed here. And now let's talk about second benefit of engine of reusing factory engine mounts from OM603 is that when I said about tilting the engine, so once the engine is tilted, then you get oil pan off center to the left of the car. And here on the right side, this is off-roading vehicle, you have a solid front axle, and this is housing of front differential, and obviously this front axle is moving up and down when the suspension is working, and this axle housing is pretty big. And what you don't want is you don't want to meet this front differential housing with the bottom of oil pan. And this is very important to keep in mind when you are swapping any engine into G-Class. So the last part is oil dipstick guide, and this must meet the depth of oil pan, and it must be also taken from OM603 engine from G-Class. And as you can see, this is just a small little touch of 603 engine. So this is also very important. Alright, so now we have a rebuilt engine which is positioned. So now we can cover all the peripherals. Okay, so let's start with right side of the engine. It's where the turbo lives. So I've sandblasted exhaust manifold. Then I painted it with VHT spray. I've also put a new gasket between the exhaust manifold. I've added new bolts, new nuts. I deleted EGR. So this was a welding job. I also had to oversize standard exhaust manifold holes to meet adapter between turbo and exhaust manifold, and this adapter comes together in a turbo kit from DP UK. And this adapter is a billet part, so it is CNC made. It's pretty heavy, but for sure it is very reliable solution, and it does not crack. The turbo is Holset HX35. It weighs around 13 kilograms, so together with adapter is almost 16 kilos of weight. This oil line also comes from diesel pump UK, so it includes to the kit. And kit also includes this return oil line, which goes directly to oil pan. And on that right side there is yet another thing that is important, but it's not maybe so good visible. But the alternator is rebuilt, painted and installed. There is also a thermostat cover, and this part is from OM606, not from my factory engine. The thermostat is new, and what's interesting is that bottom hose between cooling unit and engine is also factory from OM606. Yet another thing at the right side of the engine. This is the exhaust bypass valve, and this is a hose that must be connected to a pressurized air of turbo. Because whenever turbo is overloading system with pressure, this valve must open this bypass section of turbo. So this is pretty important. Engine breather connected like so to custom air filter, which I will cover later in this engine bay modifications video. And down there, three more things. So obviously the ground for the engine, so it goes to the negative battery terminal. T-fitting, so it was a TIG welding job. So this is oil feed to turbo. This is yet another port for temperature sensor, and over there oil drain from turbo. On the right side of the engine there is yet another sensor. There is DP UK adapter between exhaust manifold and turbo, and you can see I've installed there additional EGT sensor, so it was just a matter of drilling a hole and tapping I think 1/8 thread, and I just inserted this EGT sensor. So at the right side there are two sensors, EGT and oil temperature sensor. Alright, so now let's cover front of the engine. Nothing crazy again here. New water pump, new belt, new visco, new fan, new belt tensioner, new engine and engine coolant unit hose. I think it comes from OM603. Then what's important, this is fuel filter base, and this comes from my old engine, and the number for this is 601-092-0008, and this is factory from my previous engine. And yet another important thing is that this power steering pump comes also from my old engine, because this power steering pump should work with this power steering column. It's mostly because the OM606 pump has a different oil flow and a different oil pressure, so this is why I used factory G-class power steering pump. So yet another thing that is important at the front is this vacuum pump. So this vacuum pump comes from 606 and it cannot be changed to OM603 as the design is completely different, and the vacuum pump in a G-class is very important for the three main reasons. So the main line of the vacuum goes directly to the brake booster. The second reason is to turn off the engine. So whenever you turn off the ignition key, the vacuum is applied to manual injection pump and the engine dies. And the third reason is whenever you press a button on dashboard and you want to engage differential lockers, the vacuum is also needed to lock the lockers in all three differential lockers. So I mean in transfer case, in front and rear differential. So the vacuum pump installation is also pretty important. So as a digression, I can tell you a story, my own story. So this is a vacuum pump that comes from my factory engine, 603 engine, and as you can see, the idea of this pump is that there is some drive from the engine, and it makes this part push forward and backward, and this is how the vacuum is produced in this vacuum pump. And once I had pretty bad breakdown, these bearings gave up and they let balls all around the engine. So the balls were inside injection pump, inside oil pan, and it was a pretty big mess with this solution. And within OM606 they completely redesigned these vacuum pumps. It's completely different solution. It's super simple. No bearings in the new OM606 solution. Nothing to break, so very big improvement. Now the biggest challenge of this video is left side of the engine, or the driver side of the engine. So to do that I will have to undo the intake manifold and the engine plastic cover. But before I do that, I want to speak about my engine throttle system, because when I undo the intake manifold, the entire mechanism will be visible, and this is something that I want to talk about. But first, let's try to measure the operating range plus minus of this lever. I don't know actually how to do that more or less, but let's say that this is 120 millimeters from this beginning, and now let's go like so. Okay, and this is 66 millimeters. Okay, so having this in mind, let's write it down and I will undo this intake manifold. Okay, so I unbolted intake manifold, and by doing this I uncovered huge modifications mine. But first let's continue subject of measuring range, I mean operating range. Here I have to use tape measure, and let's measure operating range like here. So I would say it's 66, 67 millimeters, and now let's write it down. Okay, so from the previous measures we have 120 minus 66. This gives 54. But I think that if I would press with my foot, I wouldn't have that much. I think I would move it maximum to maybe 70, which would give me 50 millimeters of operating range. And now we've measured at the injection pump, and that we have operating range of 66 to 67 millimeters. So you can see that if I would connect this line directly from my foot to the injection pump, I would miss somewhere around 16 millimeters of operating range, so I could not go full throttle. Alright, so I've mocked my throttle lever harness, and as you can remember, we are missing 16 millimeters at least of operating range to push full throttle of this injection pump. And this whole harness comes from my previous engine, but it's slightly modified. So this top bracket is modified to install on top of OM606 intake manifold. This lever pushes down this shock, and the most important part of this lever harness is actually this part over here. You can see that over here this is a pivot point. So once I press down this shock, there is a movement on this pivot. And this is one arm of this lever, and this is second arm of this lever. When this shock is pressing down this horizontal lever, pushes lever of injection pump, and the secret is in the length of these arms. So this arm is shorter, this arm is longer, and now we can extend operating range. It requires more force to transfer this movement, but it also adds operating range because of different arm length. Issue with this bracket was because the engine head in OM603 is much smaller. So what I had to do is I had to move away this pivot point from the engine, and what happened next is I had to move also this lever on the other side. So in factory this ball was on the other side of the injection pump, but because, as I said, this engine head is much wider in OM606, so I had to move everything away from the engine. But once I succeeded, I'm very happy about this solution, because this extends operating range, and moreover, once you reach you bottom the operating range of injection pump, you can see down there that this shock is compressing the excess move of that primary line from pedal. So I find it a pretty good solution. Okay, so now let's cover the injection pump. So injection pump comes directly from my OM603 engine, and it was sent to DP UK to rebuild with their standards. So it has 7.7 millimeters. It is set to 400 horse power. It got outside ALDA system. The pump works with my OM603 engine oil filter base, so this is the most straightforward solution. So the fuel comes obviously from the fuel tank. So this is the line that comes from the fuel fits AN fittings. This is -6 size. This is push-on. So this is, I think, 8 millimeters internal diameter hose, and this hose goes directly to fuel heater. This is factory OM606. I decided not to delete it. Then the fuel goes to the fuel pump of the injection pump. Then the fuel goes to the fuel filter itself. Then from the fuel filter it goes to the sections of the injection pump, and then it is directed to the injectors. Injectors were checked, nothing fancy, nothing crazy over here. Checked with the factory specifications and installed. The lines comes from my OM603 engine, and this was pretty tricky to install as they didn't want to fit, so I had to bend them a little. And what's important with those lines are these plastics, I don't know, fittings, something that catches these lines, because as you know, the diesel engines vibrate a lot, and these lines cannot touch each other, because once they touch each other, they will fall into vibrations and they can break. So it is pretty important to use those plastics to catch all the lines, so they do not touch, they do not vibrate. And this is pretty finger cutting procedure to install those plastics. They are cheap, you can buy them new in Mercedes. Pretty good to do. Few more things about injection pump. It was set to 10 degrees after top dead center, according to installation guide from DP UK. Then this oil feed to anti-jerk system, it takes oil from oil filter base. Then this hose is pretty important. So this is connected to ignition switch, and once you turn the key off, vacuum is applied from the vacuum pump, and the whole engine dies. Now yet another thing, I don't know if this is G-class specific solution, but over here you can see this is electromagnet, and this is electric connection that activates this electromagnet. and while the engine is cold, it rises revolution of the engine. And the last thing that is important is this hose. So this hose is connected to outside ALDA, and then this line goes to intake manifold. So I welded this plate and I added 2 ports. So like I said, one goes to this ALDA system, and once the turbo produces pressure, so the more air gets into the cylinders, and then also pressure gets to this ALDA, and ALDA also adds more fuel, because more air requires more fuel, and if you would add only more air, this equals just higher combustion temperature, which equals problems, and more air, more fuel equals more power and more torque, and that's what it's all about. The second hose goes over here to the air pressure sensor. So this is additional sensor that I added. Okay, so now let's cover oil part of the engine. So this is factory oil filter. Nothing fancy, it's just cleaned and painted. One thing at the bottom of this filter, so in factory there is only one port, and this port is connected to oil pressure, but I want to keep factory oil pressure sensor. I added additional oil pressure sensor, and I also needed one more port for the oil line feed to the injection pump to anti-jerk system. And here down there are also connectors that I welded AN10 fittings, and this is something that I love. This is Fragola hose and Fragola fittings, and these are do-it-yourself fittings, so you can do your own hoses, and they are perfect because on this end and on the other end they are angled fittings, which means that you have to make perfect fit because you cannot bend them in length. And they are, I don't know if you can see, but they are moving. Well, in general, the angle of this fitting can be twisted. So no matter how you make those fittings, you will be always able to adjust them properly. Okay, so the last part is going to be about electrical system, which is super simple in this engine. So here you can see glow plugs. There are 6 of them. And I've made a loom, and this loom goes like this through this track. This track is original factory OM606, and then it goes to this relay, and this relay directs current to the glow plugs. And this comes from positive battery terminal, and this comes from inside of the cabin. So this turns this relay on. Now on the engine there is yet another sensor. So this sensor tells electrics that glow plugs made its own job, and lamp on the dashboard turns off, so you can start the engine. And this line also goes within this truck. There is yet another sensor, so this is engine coolant sensor, and I found these two inlets, openings in OM606 cylinder head, and I was very happy to install these both sensor from G-Class, from my previous engine. And there is yet another thing. So on the left side there is a starter, which was also rebuilt, painted and bolted, and there is electrical connection to the starter, electrics to oil pressure sensor. Alright, so I put it back all together. I will close the bonnet now, and there are two more things that I would like to discuss. The first thing are these displays, because I already told you about 4 additional sensors that I installed around the engine. So once I turn the ignition key off, they all stand up. So the first one shows oil pressure, next one shows oil temperature, so these two shows oil measurements. Next there is exhaust gases temperature and intake manifold air pressure. I like them. They are all from AutoGauge, and it will be pretty interesting to watch them. For the final shot, I would like to break down costs for you that I paid for rebuilding and swapping this engine. For the engine I paid 800 euros. For the diesel pump UK I spent 4,700 euros, and this includes rebuilding my own injection pump from my OM603 engine. It also includes adapter kit between BMW gearbox and OM606. It also includes gear stick mechanism for the BMW gearbox and turbo kit with Holset HX35 turbine. For the engine rebuild, parts plus head and cylinder block rebuild, I spent 3,500 euros. And just small example, when I told you about replacement of hydraulic valve adjustments, and each costs around 35 euros, and there is 24 of them. Gearbox GS637 DZ, I paid 1,000 euros, and this is for the complete and rebuild gearbox. Other costs like rebuilding starter, rebuilding alternator, power steering, pump, etc. I paid somewhere around 1,000 euros. So by this etc. I mean all other small costs. So in total it was like around 11,000 euros. This is how much I spent for this build, but nevertheless it was super fun adventure for me. So in this 50 minutes video I covered really a lot of subjects all around this OM606 swap. If you have any questions, please comment. And for now, thanks for watching and see you soon.